Okay, can we get organized, please? Get settled. We're running a few minutes behind. We're anxious to get into topic here.
Yes.
If there are any new arrivals, welcome. We're off to a great start. Had a great panel last night. Enjoyable dinner with the invited guest panelists, and a great start again this morning. We're going to do our best here in the Middle East panel to be a little bit more provocative. Thinking about this, I was not entirely sure whether we have a smorgasbord of rich academic issues to explore or more of a dog's breakfast that we're going to wallow around in. So we'll see where that goes. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Steve Slick. I'm the director of the Intelligence Studies Project here at the University of Texas. And it's a great honor and privilege. Today I'm going to be leading, or moderating, I should say, staying out of the way of a panel to discuss Middle East issues. And we're going to run this sort of the way we've done in the past. I'm going to allow each of the guests to speak for a couple of minutes. Then I may pose a question or two, try to tie it all up, and then we'll open it up to questions. We're going to encourage students to get involved, be more active, get up out of your chairs. As we go forward. I haven't assigned specific topics to any of the panelists, so I'll be as surprised as you are on the issues that they choose to raise.
We may surprise ourselves.
I'm pretty sure we're going to end up down in the weeds talking about Syria here before it's all over, and that's fine. So you have in the printed materials full or more accurate biographies for the distinguished panelists, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But just so I don't slight anybody, I'll very quickly tell you who we have at the table here. At the far end is my good friend Philip Mudd, former analyst from the CIA, specializing in Middle East and counterterrorism issues. Philip served in a variety of positions, including National Security Council staff, and is the deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center at CIA. In 2005, Philip did something I thought was patriotic and a little bit courageous.
Also stupid.
Yeah, maybe stupid from time to time. Philip went down to the FBI to help them stand up their intelligence and counterterrorism function. He was the first deputy director of the FBI's National Security Branch, and he consults regularly and is a frequent media commentator. Next, who's down there? That's Nick and Michael. We have Michael Singh, another friend. He's currently the managing director of the Washington Institute. Mike was a colleague of mine at the National Security Council staff from 2005 to 2008, where he served as senior director for Middle Eastern Affairs. Mike has also worked on the staffs of two secretaries of state, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. And Mike speaks and writes extensively. Most recently, is quite active on the Iran issue. We called on him last night at dinner, and he was suitably diplomatic. I tend to align myself with his views, so if somebody wants to talk about Iraq, we're welcome to do that. Tamara Wittes, to my immediate right, senior fellow and director of the Center of Middle East Policy at Brookings. 2009 to 2012, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the region. Tamara also served as the Deputy Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions, where she helped organize the U.S. response to the Arab Awakening, and she previously was affiliated with the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Middle East Institute. And batting cleanup tonight is Mick Bednarek. General John Bednarek is recently retired as a lieutenant general in the United States Army. He served almost 40 years in uniform, including 26 months as a senior defense official in Iraq and the chief of the Office of Security Cooperation in Baghdad. So he's commanded at every level of the Army in at least 4 continents by my count, going through your CV. And of particular interest to us today, General Bednarek has a very unique and fresh insights into the military and security questions in Iraq and Syria. So I didn't organize the panel in the correct seating order, but by sequence, what I'd like to do is shape this a little bit like an interagency policy meeting that many of us have suffered through countless times, and that usually opens with an intelligence briefing. So I'll turn to Philip. Tell us what we need to know.
That's going to be a really short conversation. You know, I think we have a lot of things we view as fact in this country. They're in fact judgments. So I want to offer a quick perspective on my judgments or biases, and then give you 6 or 7 areas where, if those judgments are accurate, the American perception of the world is going to be challenged. Democracy, good. Dictators, not so much. U.S. Army, good. Russians, not so much. Hold on a minute here. These are not facts. These are judgments. If you look at some of the judgments I would make about what we've seen in the past decade or more and what we will see, my first point would be if human beings have a choice in an era of insecurity, they will choose security above all else. They want not to walk out the door and have their head put on a stake. They want safety. If you look for, and if they don't want safety, their military or security service will. Good example, Egypt. I think we may see the same in Libya. Second, if we believe or accept this judgment or bias on my part about humans' interest and stability, democracy is inherently destabilizing when losers believe they've lost forever. They lose forever when you have cultures that are divided by religion, for example, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, by geography in some ways Libya, by ideology in some ways Muslim Brotherhood versus the more secular military. But we love democracy. I view it as inherently destabilizing in cultures where the losers think they lost forever. Sunnis in Iraq. They will never, I think, win again in a fair election. Third, if we accept that democracy opens fissures, when we see fissures, when we see ungoverned space, we see instability. If you look at, in my world of counterterrorism, every place from the southern Philippines to the tribal areas of Pakistan to Afghanistan, if you look to the provinces of Yemen, if you look to post-1992 Somalia, if you look to Boko Haram, if you looked at the Sahel, there is one characteristic that they all share, and that is the unwillingness or inability of a federal power to project power. So what I'm telling you is people like stability. When they have instability, sometimes that results from democracy, and sometimes that leads to extremism. And finally, to come full circle, to close those fissures, you have a few opportunities. One is a dictator. Two is a foreign intervention. Three is chaos and instability. You can dispute those. But before we fall back and say democracy is good and dictators are bad, I'd ask a question. If you walk out the door and you're going to get beheaded, what do you want? So let me close with what the implications are. Number one, I believe we'll face choices, and I don't do predictions except for the next 20 seconds. I'll predict in the next 120 days the Americans and the Russians come to a deal on Syria, because we as a people, and I'm hearing this in DC over the past week or two, are going to have to make a decision. That decision is, do we stand on principle, or do we look for a ceasefire that's not perfect? I believe our choices in some cases will be between democratic ideals and power players like dictators. Second, when we face that choice, I think often, whether we like it or not, we're going to end up with strongmen, the same kinds of people that we applauded leaving the scene, Hosni Mubarak. Number three, I think the emigration patterns we are seeing and the changing demographics in Europe change how we will view this and might lead the Europeans to have a stronger interest in pulling an increasingly isolated America back, because Europe's going to feel tremendous pressure, obviously, and that pressure is not only short-term terrorism, it's long-term demographics and immigration. I can see a scenario where the coalitions of the future are European with Americans. Next, we're going to have choices about stages of intervention. We have come to the conclusion that intervention, preventive intervention, is bad. I think there will be more judgments about this. For example, if you look at what the French did in Mali, which I still think, despite what we saw in Mali today, was a tremendous success. That was a preventive intervention against an extremist group, and highly successful. Next, when we build these coalitions, we'll be dealing with troubling partners. Those partners may have human rights violations on their hands. And when we deal with those partners and when we rebuild cultures, we will have choices about whether we want democracy or whether we deal with a partner that will bring security, and those partners will be ugly. So, lastly, if we believe that we are good and the Russians, Iranians are bad, if you look at the solutions that might lead to more peace but less democracy, there are two key players in that region who will help ensure that solution, and that's Russia and Iran. So, I guess I'd close by saying, as an analyst, I think sometimes we confuse time and time and time again the difference between a judgment and a fact, the difference between what we think and what we know, and we believe that yesterday represents tomorrow. And I would suggest that yesterday never represents tomorrow. We never know what the trends are, except that every trend we see in retrospect is one we didn't predict. And I've tried to give you 6 or 7 ways that will make us uncomfortable, that suggest the world is changing, but that are hard to dispute. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. That's a lot to work with. Particularly like your interpretation of the Arab awakening. I'll ask Tamara to comment on that. She was involved from the policy side.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Will and Bobby for the invitation and for gathering such a fantastic group of people for these several days. It's really a treat to be up here with these fine gentlemen. And I want to thank you, Phil, for laying out that set of judgments. I think, speaking as somebody who spent the last 15 years studying the breakdown of authoritarian stability in the Arab world, I'm going to dispute some of those analytical judgments. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but let me try and give you an alternative explanation for why and how the Middle East got to be as disordered as it is today. And it is disordered today in a way that it hasn't been in more than half a century. And today's disorder came about because the forces that sustained that autocratic stability that the US relied on, that helped us pursue our interests in the region for a half century in which we were dominant in that region, that autocratic stability was crumbling for decades in the face of local trends, demographic trends, and global trends that eroded the basic bargain, that authoritarian bargain between government and citizens. And the crumbling of that old social contract, the really poor way in which most regional leaders responded to it, produced widespread discontent that burst into the open in 2010, toppled 4 governments, shook several others, and generated this historic upending of the region. And that is not to say, let me be very clear, that the Arab Spring caused the turmoil and violence that the Middle East is witnessing today. What we're witnessing today is the outcome of a long brewing crisis. It's a crisis that took several decades to germinate, that regional governments failed to address adequately, that the United States failed to address adequately, that generated these uprisings, that exacerbated social divisions, that further weakened and in some cases collapsed state institutions, enabled the growth of radical and violent movements, and in at least 4 countries has led to civil war. And it's no accident that the parts of the region today that are the most violent and the most disordered, that is Libya and Syria, are the places where leaders, having failed to act in a manner that could have prevented popular uprising, then sought to repress that popular dissent through the use of force. And it was that violent response that, rather than restoring order, broke these states to bits and drove these societies to civil war. The state apparatus that turned against its own citizens generated a demand for security, Phil. Yes, absolutely. And those citizens turned to sectarian militias and extremist groups with horrific agendas. And as the institutions of basic governance and community order broke down, those with guns to impose their will gained power. So to me, more than anything else, we have to understand that it is the terrible choices of those terrible leaders, Muammar Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad, that created the openings that al-Qaeda, ISIS, sectarian killers across the region today are exploiting for their own purposes, including threatening American interests. Now, those same conditions are absolutely creating a demand for order in the rest of the Middle East. And that means that Arab citizens who don't trust their governments are turning more and more to ethnic identity or sectarian identity or rigid ideology to identify friend and foe. And in places where the governments are still functioning, fearful publics are embracing dictators who can provide security. That is correct. But I think we have to ask ourselves, especially given the experience of the last several decades and the breakdown of the pre-existing authoritarian order, whether the security those dictators are promising to provide is in fact sustainable, whether it's sustainable for the people of the region, whether it's sustainable for the United States, given our interests in the region. What we've got today in the Middle East is a collapse of order and a collapse of authority. People are seeking security, but they don't trust existing institutions. They don't trust religious institutions. They don't trust governing institutions. That creates tremendous challenges. Now, the roots of the region's upending in this fraying, broken social contract reminds us that ISIS, as dramatic and terrifying as it is not just an accelerant of chaos, but a symptom of an underlying disorder. It's not the cause, and it's not the disease in the Middle East today. And so I have to agree with the comments that were made in the previous panel on stability operations that a policy by the United States that is focused tightly on counterterrorism or countering ISIS is a mistake, not only for the reasons that were discussed in the last session, but also because it won't work to solve the problem of regional order. Now, as John mentioned last night, across the region, in this state of disorder, we have a lot of axes of conflict operating at the same time. Conflicts over borders, a power competition amongst major powers in the region, sectarian conflict, conflict over the role of political Islam. But I think that recognizing those multiple axes of conflict is not a sufficient guide to policy. It also, the fact that we have these multiple axes of conflict, I think also should emphasize to us that there's no magic bullet. Changing state borders, carving up Iraq, carving up Syria, probably not going to be a magic bullet to solve sectarian conflict. Reinstalling dictator in Egypt, probably not going to be sufficient to deal with the degree of polarization and pure human misery in Egypt today. So given this degree of disorder, what can we do? Let me throw out a few ideas and then I'll stop. First, as I said, I think we have to recognize the nature of the problem. It was a long time coming. Phil says it wasn't predicted, but there I do have to differ. There were a number of us working on the region who recognized that that order was breaking down. And if anyone's interested, there's a little book out on the book table out there that I published in 2008 on that subject.
Still in print.
Now, it was a long time coming, and returning stability to the region will require some model of sustainable governance. Now, the models of governance that are out there in the region today are ISIS and renewed authoritarianism, a la Sisi. I don't think either of those models of governance are sustainable. Rebuilding sustainable governance, well, we just spent an hour and a half talking about stability operations. That's the very, very beginning of that process. But that is, I think, the challenge that we face, and it's the subject of a paper I'll have coming out next month with the Atlantic Council. The second thing we have to do is we have to recognize what won't work. A counterterrorism-focused approach won't work. And I think President Obama's Syria policy is symbolic in this regard. He hasn't been able to get our regional partners on side because, as we were discussing last night, they're more worried about Iran than ISIS. And he hasn't been able to get local Syrian partners on side because they're more worried about Assad than ISIS. President Obama said the other day at the G20 summit that Assad's war on his own people is the major root cause of ISIS's emergence. And I would agree. But President Obama's policy on Syria does not address Assad's war on his own people. So we have to recognize what won't work. And an ISIS-fixated American policy in Syria will not work. We have to recognize renewed authoritarianism won't work. This is Putin's preferred strategy. This is the strategy preferred by some of our regional partners. And I understand why there's a certain nostalgia for Arab authoritarianism, given what we're faced with. But authoritarian stability in the Middle East was a mirage 10 years ago, and it's a mirage now. Authoritarianism suppresses dissent. It doesn't eliminate it. It pushes disputes out of the political system and therefore makes violent dispute more likely, not less. And if any of you have seen a great book that came out recently called Why Nations Fail, there's a lot of great evidence now as to how and why authoritarian governments wreck economies. Singapore is the exception, not the rule. So there really is no substitute for cultivating more sustainable governance. And I think we've got to start with a focus on conflict resolution at the diplomatic level, dealing with these civil wars, but also at the very local level. And here I think, you know, the one tentative alternative model out there is Tunisia. And what did Tunisia get right that everybody else got wrong? It had political parties that did not embrace majoritarianism, going to Phil's point. They did not pursue a winner-take-all strategy. They wanted to share the risks of governing, and so they were willing to compromise. And somehow, partly because of the strength of Tunisian civil society, they were able to find platforms and forums to negotiate their disagreements peacefully and come to a compact. That's the kind of capability that I think this region is going to need. And while the United States cannot snap its fingers and produce it, I think we have to recognize that we have an interest in helping cultivate it. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. Mike?
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. It's great to be here, and I thank the Clements Center and the Strauss Center and your project for putting this together. Steve, you're right that I have spoken copiously over the summer about the Iran nuclear negotiations, which is why I don't want to talk about it today. It's just,
How'd that work out?
this is what I call the Freebird problem for those of you who are Leonard Skinner fans.
I got my lighter here somewhere.
I can explain that more later to the students in the room. What I do want to talk about is, look at I ultimately disagree with Phil, although I respect Phil a lot. And my presentation will talk about why I disagree with Phil, but more importantly, why I think policymaking so often goes wrong, in this region in particular, but in general as well. And I'm going to give you sort of three paradoxes of policymaking and try to explain what's going on in the region through that. My first paradox is there is no such thing as the long term, but we have to have a long-term strategy. What do I mean by this? Look at what's happening in the Middle East right now, and then this will correspond a lot with what Tamara just told you. The region is suffering from a twin collapse, I would say. The first collapse is the collapse of states and state institutions. And Tamara went over that, and I agree with how she phrased that. And frankly, that is not entirely finished. It's not just that the story there is Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq. You look at what's happening in the Gulf states these days, and I don't think that there will necessarily be an Arab Spring in the Gulf states, but there is a need to renegotiate the social contract between state and citizen in these Gulf states because the sort of economic boom time they've been enjoying may be nearing an end, and they have to make some tough reforms. The second collapse of this twin collapse that we're seeing is a collapse of the regional security architecture. which really I'd say since the first Gulf War, has really been static. It's focused on a very heavy U.S. forward presence, strong and autocratic allies, and so forth, for a variety of reasons, which I won't detail right now out of consideration of time. That architecture has collapsed. We have stepped back. A lot of our allies are gone. And in its place, there is no new strategy. In its place, instead, we see this sort of chaotic jockeying between medium-sized states, none of whom really have tremendous capacity or preeminence over the others. And this twin collapse leaves a vacuum in the region. Into that vacuum steps Iran. Look, Iran is present in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. It's not. The only place it really isn't is in Libya, which is maybe too far away for the Iranians. Into this gap, into this vacuum, steps jihadist groups. And everywhere we see this conflict, we see jihadist groups spreading, including, by the way, in Yemen, which is a story which doesn't get written about very much here. But I mean, for a long time, until maybe just recently, I think intel officials would have said Al-Qaeda in Yemen is really our biggest homeland threat. And it's still there. It's not gone away. This story will come back, unfortunately. And the Russians, of course, have now stepped into a gap that, frankly, we left and the Western powers left in Syria. I think that what Putin is doing is opportunistic. He's doing it because he could do it, because there wasn't a great barrier to entry, as it were, into Syria. So you have this twin collapse. You have a vacuum that it creates. And any U.S. strategy in the region that's going to succeed, I think, has to address both of these things. You have to first counter and push back those sort of spoilers, those bad actors from my position, from my perspective, who have filled this vacuum. So you have to push back not just on ISIS, but you do, I think, have to push back at the same time on Iranian destabilization and, frankly, on what Russia is doing. That sounds like a tall order. But in fact, it's necessary. It's not a tall order in the sense that if you do something else, you'll fail. So any new strategy has to address these two things. But we often really miss the bigger picture, because a lot of these things are hard to do. When you say institution building, or we need to address the collapse of states, I think policymakers look at that and say, well, there's nothing I can do about that. I can take Ramadi. I can sit down and negotiate with the Iranians. But these other problems, they just seem too complex. But if you sort of press into that a little bit, we have been militarily engaged in Iraq for 25 years. This isn't sort of a 2013 to now conflict. This isn't a 2003 to now conflict. We've been there really since the first Gulf War in some way, shape, or form. 25 years. In those same 25 years, there has been very little economic progress in any of these states, very little meaningful political reform in any of these states, and really not a meaningful advance in the sort of regional security architecture between ourselves and our many allies in the region. We have been working on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process for 37 years, you could argue, maybe 25, depends how you look at it. We were engaged in the Iran nuclear negotiations for 13 years. So all the long-term it's an accumulation of all of your short-term decisions. And if you decide you're going to put off what you consider the hard work, the long-term work, you find that it just won't get done. And I think the right question to ask yourself is, over those 13, 25, or 37 years, what could we have done gradually and patiently to give ourselves better tools to face the conflicts and threats that we face today? I think we could have done plenty, and I think we just didn't. And there is a certain some people will use the term solutionism that takes hold in policy-making circles. And this was described to me once by a French diplomat who put it this way. He said, why did the Iranians get the better of the United States in the nuclear negotiations? Which I think they did. I wasn't quite so sharp on that last night, but I think the Iranians got the better of us. And the French put it this way. They said, if you go into negotiations with the Americans love to solve problems. And so you say, the Iranians would come in and say, here's our problem. And the American response is, all right, let's figure out how we solve this. If you do the same thing with an Iranian diplomat, if you come in as an American and say, here's my problem, the Iranians just push it back across the table to you and say, that's your problem. So we're gripped by solutionism. That's the first paradox, is that the long term is made up of your short-term decisions, whether you like it or not. So you have to have a long-term guide that guides your short-term decisions. Number two, there are no military solutions, but there also are no diplomatic solutions. Does that mean there's no solutions? No. So let me explain what I mean. We have a worrying tendency, and this is not exclusive to one party, to make policy starting with tactical pronouncements. No boots on the ground. We will not engage with the Iranians on the other side. Well, we ended up doing both things, haven't we? We ended up engaging with the Iranians, not just under the Obama administration, but under the Bush administration. We have boots on the ground in both Syria and Iraq. We're keeping them in Afghanistan. So all these pronouncements really came to naught. Why did they come to naught? And by the way, when you say it and then you don't do it, it's worse than never saying it in the first place. This is one of the lessons I think that should come out of the AIIB debacle, which was really a diplomatic debacle, frankly. And the China panel maybe will talk more about that. Because this sort of approach to policymaking is not sustainable. We all know that ends have to match means. This is sort of an article of faith among strategists. And I think you can look at the 2003 Iraq War, and you can look at what we're doing today in Syria and Iraq and say you have an ends-means mismatch. And therefore, this is why the policy is, one of the reasons the policy is not succeeding. But it's not a two-way street. I think it's a one-way street. You have to start that process by, defining your objectives, defining your strategy, and then being flexible, and ruthlessly flexible, I would say, with the tools that you use to advance your strategy. Now, you may end up at that stage and say, well, in fact, the sort of tools and the effort required is way too much, and so we have to then go back and redefine our strategy, maybe redefine our objectives. But if you start with the tactics and say, let's come up with a policy that doesn't require boots on the ground, that doesn't require engagement with the Iranians, that doesn't require this or that, you're never going to end up with good policy because you've bounded the policy conversation in an awkward and unsustainable way. I would say that the lesson from this is, as I said, there's no military solutions, there's no diplomatic solutions, there's only solutions that combine our tools in a multidisciplinary and flexible way. And we've seen this time and again. We saw this, I would say, with the Iran nuclear negotiations. Why didn't we get a better deal with the Iranians? I think it is because towards the end of the process, we made clear to the Iranians that military force was not an option. Further sanctions were not an option. And when it comes down to it, negotiations, whether you're negotiating for a car or negotiating a nuclear deal, involve one side, both sides really, comparing the deal that's on offer with the alternatives, the consequences of saying no. If the consequences of saying no are meaningless or insignificant, then you can say no, and you will say no, until you get a better deal, the deal that you want. And this is what happened to us in the Iran nuclear negotiations. We tend to use military and diplomacy in sequence, or talk about using them in sequence rather than in concert. And that works in both directions for military and diplomacy. So look at Syria now. We want to defeat ISIS in Syria. The French want to defeat ISIS in Syria. How do we do this? We know, I think everyone would agree, although John made an interesting point about this last night that I thought was intriguing, that airstrikes alone will not defeat ISIS. A ground force is necessary. Everyone seems to also agree that we don't want that to be our ground force. We want that to be somebody else's ground force. We can understand why that would be preferable. We want it to be a regional or a local ground force. But the problem there is that the regional and local ground forces, the rebels, our allies, consider Assad and Iran to be the big problem. It's not that they think ISIS isn't a problem, but they think Assad and Iran are the first problem, their chief threat. This means that in order to activate those forces, in order to get those forces into the fight against ISIS, we need to do something about the government in Damascus. You need a new government in Damascus. You need a political transition. Tony Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State, said this again today, that you cannot have an end to the conflict in Syria until Assad is gone. And this is why. So this is why we have talked about a political transition being necessary. But it turns out that Assad will not go willingly. He will not just agree to go away, shockingly. So you have to, he believes, in fact, with good reason, that he can prevail militarily, I think. He has the support of the Iranians. He now has the support of the Russians, which is a powerful military, as Phil said. And so we need to convince him that that's wrong, I think. So we need to change the military balance, I believe, in Syria. And there's a number of options to do that. Hillary Clinton, in her speech 2 days ago, said we need no-fly zone. She said we need to add more special operators. There's a number of things you could go through. But you have to start with the objective and say, if I want to accomplish this outcome, how do I do it? That's really what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is not talking. It's not meetings. It's not conferences and summits, although those things are always fun, and we all like them as diplomats. Diplomacy is about transforming power into outcomes. All kinds of power, hard, soft, smart, as it were. The third paradox that I want to talk to you about, and then I'm going to stop, is the best time to resolve conflicts is before they start. And this is something we are really bad at. And here I disagree with Phil, and I agree with Tamara, that so many of the problems that we face today were foreseeable problems. I would argue, personally, that the Ukraine crisis was a foreseeable problem. Could you have foreseen exactly what would transpire? No, but could you foresee that Russia was not simply going to willingly allow Ukraine to go into the European or Western orbit? Absolutely, absolutely. But if you were to ask US policymakers about this issue prior to the Maidan and prior to this crisis, they would say Ukraine is a peripheral issue for the United States. Well, it's peripheral until suddenly something happens, and then suddenly it's a potential cause for conflict between the US and Russia, which is pretty serious, which means that it should have been serious before the crisis happened. The fact that you have refugees flowing out of Syria in the way that you do, the fact that you have jihadist groups growing in Syria in the way that you do, these were predicted not just by Tamara, but she did write about these things, but by a host of Middle East analysts. The fallout from the 2003 invasion of Iraq was predicted, not just by a pundit on TV, but by folks in government. Bill Burns is famously associated with this. So we have to ask ourselves as a policymaking community, if these things are predictable, why don't we do more conflict prevention? Why don't we do more strategic planning to head off these crises, to strengthen allies, to weaken opponents, to deter enemies, and so forth, rather than just finding ourselves constantly fighting these rearguard battles to try to stop crises once they've started. And once they've started, they are extremely difficult to stop, especially a civil conflict like we see in Syria. I would argue that that's, in a sense, what maybe a place like the Clements Center, maybe a place like a project like yours, Steve, can help do, frankly, because part of foreseeing problems is understanding history and understanding what has come before. And so I'm going to end by commending the fact that we have a Clements Center and an ISP, and encourage all of you to help prevent these things from happening in the future. Thank you.
Well, you're certainly coming back. Thanks, Mike.
So we've signed up a new sponsor.
Yeah, double that guy's honor. Okay, so that's a great description of what we've done wrong in the past and some of the challenges we confront, and as every good interagency meeting should. This will end the formal portion by asking the U.S. military, Mick in this case, to describe his best in military advice. What can you do for us?
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. I kind of harken back to what you mentioned right up front. The Middle East, some would often highlight as a true dog's breakfast. So the real question is it kibbles and bits or Alpo? Is it dry and crunchy, or is it soft and mushy? And I'd like to frame a couple things, a little bit of background. I'm going to cover 5 particular areas. I mean, most people understand that there's a timeline and a continuum for most things. We've been replete with history and some pretty good vignettes just over the few panels that we have had. But a lot of what we talk about in history is important because it shapes and defines our actions going towards the future. But I'd like to highlight a more recent context just in the past couple years. And Steve highlighted, I've been in Baghdad recently just for the past 26 months. People ask me, Mick, why the hell were you in Baghdad for 26 months? And yeah, that was probably a mistake as well. But similar to our State Department colleagues, USAID, our chiefs of station, et cetera, you normally go to a deployment for a relative short period of time, 6 to 9 months, maybe 12 months. And my initial intent was to go for just 12 months. 12 months turned into 18, 18 turned into 24, 24 to 26. And thankfully, my bride put up with me through all of that. But I want to highlight why, and specifically the time periods. And there's, for those the cadets in the back, because I'm going to call on you to answer some questions here in a little bit. But there's some 5 particular periods. The first one, when I got there in the spring of 2013, the task and purpose, kind of as Mike highlighted, we often get broiled up, particularly as strategists, of ends, ways, and means. And you work through that of the strategic to operational and get down to the tactical task and purpose. So the mission then in the spring of 13, quite honestly for everybody, was to close all of those sites that we had remaining in Iraq from the war period. Everybody knows, okay, the political decision was made December of 11, everybody out of the pool, go home. And as was articulated very clearly in the last panel, that in the broader scheme of things, the Iraqi security forces were left in relatively decent shape. I'll get into the issues later on with Maliki and the transition of government to Hyder al-Abadi. But those sites were the focus of effort to close. And we're talking about thousands of contractors, some of the United States military that were directly tied to foreign military sales and foreign military financing of all the equipment that we as the United States, in the focus of U.S. foreign policy and objectives, continue to support across the Middle East, Iraq being the 4th largest. So that was the focus of effort initially for that first time period from about spring of 13 to December of 13. And I think everybody recognizes what happened in December of 13, where you had the initial protest sites in Al-Anbar that really started the precursor, if you will, of what has happened since then. These protest sites out in the vicinity of Ramadi, and you've got to remember, historically, in Iraq, the Minister of Defense is one of the senior Sunnis within the government of Iraq. And in fact, Dr. Sadoun Dalimi was in Anbari, so he spent a heck of a lot of time out there trying to sort through his own people, not only the Delaine tribe, but you could rattle off a half a dozen different tribes out there that are fairly sizable in the overall federation. But as he would highlight personally to me, he says, hey, General, we can get all of the Sunni tribes together in one conference and we will never agree on anything. It kind of gets to the internal Iraqi challenge of their version of a dog's breakfast. But there's a great Iraqi phrase that says when there is no center, there are only sides. And for a while, I kind of questioned, well, what the heck does that mean? And I kind of think, okay, well, everybody wants to be on a winning side versus a losing side, and particularly if you're a tribesman, you will flow and bend with whoever is winning at that particular moment. But it doesn't mean any of that, and it doesn't mean that we should all take sides. It doesn't mean we need to be on the sideline, but rather we should strive to find the center and work together. And that's from the Iraqi perspective, not the U.S. perspective, but it highlights the framework of how they look at things. So that December 13, that second period through February of 14, just a relatively short period of time, because it was instructive what was happening back here in Washington, D.C., because of the protest sites, Maliki on the phone, deputies committees, principals committees, the vice president, and the dialogue to ramp up a significant effort in foreign military sales, primarily of ammunition, munitions, etc., to sort through and help against this evolution of what was happening out in Al-Anbar. The third period that I highlighted is from early 14 until what everybody knows what happened on the 30th of April 2014, which is what? Which was the national elections there in Iraq, where you had, just prior to that, of course, Nouri al-Maliki changed the constitution to allow him to run for the third term, etc. Thankfully, that did not happen. Enter Hyder al-Abadi, and by Iraqi constitution, he's got 90 days to seat the cabinet, to form his ministries, etc. And oh, by the way, during that time frame from 30 April until the end of summer, what happened? Well, so you have early June, of course, ISIS or Daesh comes across the Syrian border into Nineveh, overruns Mosul, the complete capitulation of 2 Iraqi security force divisions, the 4th Federal Police Division. The rest is history as that continues their southern movement towards Baghdad. And oh, by the way, the United States, as you know, a lot of policy and discourse, exactly what Michael highlighted of, where will we go? What are the ends, ways, and means? What is our response? What will we do? And quite honestly, until the 8th of August of 2014, which is our first airstrikes, what was a trigger for that? And well, the historians will tell you the trigger for the U.S. involvement in the airstrikes up in vicinity of Erbil is because why? It was because of our consulate up there was threatened. When you have Daesh starting to come through, completely overran Mosul, getting close to the consulate, then that is the trigger for U.S. military action, again, in support of U.S. foreign policy. And oh, by the way, during that time frame, you have a newly elected prime minister, still trying to seat the government. The Iraqi security forces have collapsed. You have our ambassador then, Steve Beecroft, who many of us here in this room know, was getting ready to depart, Ambassador Stu Jones coming in. So you have the transition not only of the U.S. diplomatic footprint there in Baghdad, coupled with all of those other friction points that I highlighted with the Iraqis highlighting to me as a senior defense official, says, hey, General, we have the strategic framework agreement that, oh, by definition, from our perspective, your responsibility is to help us. Where are you? And the answer is we were not there. And I highlight that because it's important, and one of the questions I'm going to pose for the audience, along with 4 other questions, is what filled that void? And I think everybody here knows that the principal focus that filled that void was the neighbors to the east with the significant Iranian influence. And the final period that I highlight after this government formation, the formation of the United States policy. Countless numbers, as Tamara knows, everybody here knows, countless numbers of deputies committees, principals committees, NSC, formulating that policy. And there was a lot of discourse whether this should be an Iraq first or an ISIL first strategy. And as it evolved with a lot of dialogue back and forth on the diplomacy side, and certainly from the chairman in our view in Baghdad through Central Command, was this needs to be a broader perspective. And I'm on public record back then, and I stand that this is not an Iraqi fight, this is not even a regional fight, but a growing global issue that must be addressed. So the focus of not only an Iraq first fell off the table, but for an ISIL broader perspective across the Levant. And then lastly, the period is what next? So is the U.S. response forming a joint task force, the evolution of this train, advise, and assist Iraqi security forces? And as many of you know, you read about it in the news routinely, is all of our congressional delegations that would come through Baghdad, along with several in this room that attended some of those CODEL visits. I'd get the finger in the chest routinely, say, you're the senior defense official here in country, General. What the hell's going on? How did this happen? How did the Iraqi security forces collapse? Tell me what is different and why we, the American people, should now invest more billions and billions of dollars to what was a failed action or strategy where we spent almost $1 trillion with 170,000 soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen on the ground, and nothing happened. And I said, after I would push back on that in support of the commander-in-chief at the time, before I retired, what I would highlight, quite honestly, to everybody in here is the real key difference now is the Prime Minister Hyder al-Abadi. A very, very significant difference. He's a player, huge political challenges, not only with his own party, the Dawah in the state of law and the National Alliance. We've got to work through that. He knows that as well as others, and I can address that a little bit more in Q&A. A couple questions for everybody to consider. And again, our cadet colleagues and those in the $1 section back there in the Bob Euchre seats. Often the question I get is, okay, you know, should we increase ground troops, yes or no? There's been tomes written on that particular question. But fundamentally, you have to first answer the question, is this our fight? And number two is, I would highlight to everybody in here, we certainly have enough troops to do what we are doing today. But the real question is, are we doing enough? And I'd also highlight one of the key things that was brought up in the last panel, but we really didn't get to. The question is, hey, don't forget, everybody, this is a sovereign country. The Iraqis have a vote. And I know them, just about know them all pretty well. And they would highlight, hey, we want the United States support. The United States is our preferred supplier, but we want to control it. Very, very significant difference from what it was several years ago. Second question to ponder, you know, where are the Kurds associated with all this? Will we eventually have a Kurdistan, a Sunnistan, a Shiistan? We kind of talked about that in the past. That is not a new concept. We highlighted a little bit about that yesterday. I have my own views of where that potentially will be going on the political side, and then what will be the military response. Tamara highlighted a bit ago is the political and the military strategy and the partnership associated with that. My perspective is, it is, if you like percentages of things, the solution is 80% political, 20% military. It is the DIME, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic perspective of the broader view of national power. But the military view is a very small M with a big D kind of leading the way. Big D does not include dog's breakfast. The last thing I'd highlight is, when will President Barzani make the call to seek independence? In knowing both the Barzani clan, both Masoud Barzani, Masroor, and Nechervan, the prime minister, some would argue that they are much closer than many people think that they are in that regard. But he's also pretty shrewd. He sees himself as the father of the modern Kurds, regardless of their location, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and others. But that in and of itself is problematic. And the last thing I'd highlight is, what is really the true challenge associated with the Iranian influence? How deep are they in Baghdad? I can answer that question at a little bit later time. But as I highlighted, December of 11 when we left, there was a void. It was not filled by us. It was filled by those that are just a short drive across the border into downtown Baghdad. Tied to that is the significant influence that the religious affiliation, particularly with Sistani, continues to play to this day. That is a voice of, quite honestly, a voice of surprising reason of what is ongoing with the politics in Baghdad, regardless of Badr and the new ministers. Steve, I'll stop there and we'll go for Q&A.
All right, great. Thanks, Mick. So we've got 20 minutes left. I propose that we use it as follows. I'd like to offer each of the panelists sort of a lightning round, and then we'll go to questions. You have the option of either responding to something offensive that you heard from one of your co-panelists, or you can tackle my question, which is, you know, in this environment of limitations on U.S. direct ability to influence these hard issues that you're describing, what do we think about, or what should be our principles for defining some allies, partners, and proxies? Seems to be the way we're going to have to advance our interests in the region. and we can approach that in a number of different ways. We inherited some historic relationships. Not clear to me those all work for us today in the same way they have. So you can either tackle that one, how should we go about picking our allies, partners, and proxies in the region, or respond to anything else you heard, but keep it brief, please. Phil.
That's your problem. No.
This is my sole function.
I'd like to do both. This is going to give me terrific pain to agree with Tamara. I'm going to capture both of them. I was talking about a return to authoritarianism because I think people want security. I do not think that's sustainable. So I don't think it's good. But I would just say, to answer your question, I think short-term decision makers will say the right solution will delay stopping migration flows, stopping 250,000 people from dying. And I think if that's our solution, I believe that Russia is part of the answer. In other words, who has leverage on trying to figure out a solution for Assad? We don't, I don't think. We have modest leverage on the military side, but I think there's going to be short-term choices that we'll regret in 10 years or 20 years. I think I know what they will be, and I think some of the answers to those choices are people we don't like. That's Iran and Russia.
Yeah, I would agree with Phil in the issue of Russia, and I also agree with their prediction of 120 days. I think it may even be sooner than that. I'm asked often, says, okay, hey, listen, we just recently signed or partnered with a memorandum of understanding with the Russian aircraft. They have sea-based platforms that they are using every day, firing into Syria. Long-range strategic bombers daily into Syria. The memorandum of understanding provides a safety of use more than anything else because, again, our policy is we are not coordinating with Russia in what they're doing, but the safety of aircraft, our airmen, crews, et cetera, is paramount to everybody, regardless of what country that they're in. But I think we're very close. I think it needs to happen, and I think the other regional partners, where can we stand from a position of strength? Who are our strong partners in the region? Is it the Saudis, King Abdullah in Jordan, the GCC as a general rule and start point, and the strength of our ambassadors from both Steve Beecroft now in Egypt, Barb Leaf, I mean, on and on. There are some capabilities there that we can leverage with our partners in the region to work towards a appropriate end state.
Mike.
On the question of allies, so I guess the question is allies and adversaries, I mean, based on the previous comments. You know, I sort of, in my comments, I gave sort of one half of Sun Tzu, right, which is, Sun Tzu said, know yourself. That was the part that we don't quote as much, and that's what I was talking about. There's also sort of know your enemy, and I think that a lot of these questions really have to start with a deep understanding of the other side. Again, something that intelligence analysts are supposed to bring. And you hear a lot that, you know, we share interests with the Iranians or the Russians in the Middle East. It's absolutely true. We share interests with the Chinese as well. We share some objectives with these states. So, of course, we should be able to cooperate with them. That's just not the way it works in real life, because there's also this element of strategy and priorities, right? The Chinese, for example, have interests which overlap tremendously with ours. So why aren't they patrolling the Strait of Hormuz and intervening in Syria and Iraq and so forth? Well, because they just have a very different strategy for this region, and they have very different priorities in the world. When you look at Iran, you know, Iran's interest, I think, my main interest in Syria is not fighting ISIS. This is the problem we have. Iran uses Syria to project power into the Levant to serve its greater sort of strategic aims. On top of that, there is as I mentioned last night, there is a domestic sort of fracas playing out in Iran because there are plenty in Iran, the hardliners especially, who are really now clinging to this sort of anti-American pillar of the regime that was put forth by Khomeini in 1979 or before, actually, and don't want to let it go. And so the idea now of cooperating with the Americans has become extremely contentious for them. And so the likelihood of them simply saying, hey, we share a common enemy, let's cooperate, I don't think it's going to happen for strategic and for sort of domestic reasons. I would put the Russians in the same camp, frankly. Yes, Vladimir Putin probably worries about terrorism, and he worries about Russians going to Syria and back. But I think he also worries about color revolutions and leaders being toppled by Western coalitions. and I don't think he'll agree to see Assad off. I don't think that that's something he would view as a positive outcome for his interests and strategy in the Middle East. So while I don't think we should ever sort of, I don't think we should disinvite the Russians from our Vienna and Geneva conferences. I don't think we should necessarily even disinvite the Iranians. I think we need to be realistic about they have interests, they have strategies. You have to impose costs and offer benefits which affect their interests and strategies, not ones which we think are great or bad, but ones which are meaningful to them, in a sense, both on the cost and benefit side, if that makes sense.
Larger intelligence budgets, if I heard you correctly.
That was the summary of what I said.
That
Absolutely.
was it right there.
Gotcha.
State Department budgets.
So very briefly, I want to riff off something Mike said in his opening remarks, which is that, we've had a period of historically overwhelming American military presence and engagement in the Middle East over the last quarter century. And we've had a half century where the United States has been the unchallenged guarantor of security in this region, and the region largely liked it that way, and the rest of the world largely liked it that way. And, so there's a problem of differing objectives with the Russians and Chinese that Mike laid out, and I don't disagree with that, but there's also just a free rider problem. I think the Obama administration came in 2009 with the idea that it was going to wind down the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It wanted to place heavier bets in East Asia, and so it wanted a security architecture in the Middle East that would be revised, that would rely more on regional partners, that would be more about burden sharing. But events in the region overtook that approach, and the partners for the United States in forging that kind of regional security architecture are now either internally focused, like the Egyptians, who are simply not going to have the capability to play a major regional role for the coming years, or they disagree fundamentally with the United States on some of where these problems came from and what needs to be done about it. And that's true, I think, even of our allies in the Gulf. And so I think that unless we can bridge those gaps, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to establish a regional security architecture that doesn't have American engagement, very heavy American engagement at the center. I'm not happy saying that, but I think that's the reality we face.
Can I say one thing about this,
Sure.
Chief?
Yeah.
I hate to take more time, but I do want to point out that the free rider problem is a real problem. And I agree with Tamara on this. But you can't, the solution to the free rider problem can't just be, okay, well, we're going to step back and let others do it. Because I think we haven't, as I said, invested in that ally capacity over the last 2 or 3 decades such that they could step forward and do things in a way that we're comfortable with.
Well, they've tried, but they've resisted it because they didn't want us to
for
step
many
back.
reasons, I think we haven't done it effectively. And so there are reverberations to these allies trying to do things on their own that we just don't like. And you can make another, to take this out of the Middle East and to use a different example. Look at Central Asia. We spend a lot of resources fighting terrorism in Central and South Asia. In doing so, we provide a security good for the Chinese and free up resources they might otherwise have to spend on sort of counterinsurgency to spend on capabilities which are meant to counter us. So what do you do about this? Do you stop fighting terrorism in this part of the world? Do you force the Chinese somehow to help you? Or do you just keep doing what you're doing and accept that this is a cost? These aren't simple problems to simply walk away from.
You attend our China panel.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
We'll be convening later.
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. We don't have a whole lot of time, but back to the cadets. I need a question. I'm sorry?
We've got,
Oh, okay.
good.
Recalibrate. 20 minutes. I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Cadet Metz, United States Military Academy. Mr. Singh, you said that Putin, which I agree with, will not drop Assad, and that you say cooperation isn't working in real life. I'd like to go back. Ms. Wittes, you said that we shouldn't have an ISIS-centric approach, and we must focus on Assad as well. In the last month or so, ISIS has attacked 2 P5 nations, directly making them one of the most pertinent threats to our own national security. The Russian foreign minister said, I like the analogy, he said, America's like a cat who wants to eat the fish but doesn't want to get his feet wet. And they've also broken the silence on the lip service that we've been putting out to deconflict the airstrikes. Is Assad a big enough a big enough want of the United States that we should not work with Moscow? Or can Paris be the road from Washington to Moscow? Is it possible to have a real comprehensive plan with regard to ISIS in the Middle East without working with Moscow?
Well, look, I think that the way that you set up the question, who's the bigger threat, Assad or ISIS, is the wrong way to set up the question. What I tried to go through when I was talking about that second paradox is we have a set of judgments, as Phil would say, about the situation in the region. We have a strategy, and there's a gap in the strategy, right? You hear a U.S. official, Secretary of State John Kerry, Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken today, saying this war cannot end until Assad is gone. So you can say we want to fight ISIS, but if the war is really what gives rise to these jihadist groups and feeds them and fuels them and brings the foreign fighters, well, ending the war, it has to be part of your anti-ISIS strategy, right? How do you end the war? If it can't end with Assad there, Assad won't step down willingly, Putin won't abandon him, and so forth. That's the question which isn't answered by this kind of just simple comparative framework. Should we work with Moscow? If Moscow is willing to commit to a strategy that we think will be successful, frankly, I don't see very much reason not to. But so far that hasn't been the case. There's a real sort of strategic divergence between the U.S. and Russia. That's the problem.
I agree with Mike. Not on everything, but on this.
Take that as a blanket.
Yeah, no, I also agree, but I put it perhaps in a little bit different context for you as you're writing your next term paper. Some would say, and there's pretty good op-eds on this, that Russia's goal is to kind of put the international community and world opinion in front of two choices, Assad or ISIL. And that's going to that discourse will be on for quite some time. But a lot of people say, hey, why haven't we succeeded? All of the Middle East countries are not in this fight. They're not. And you can identify, just look on the map of who is actively engaged. And quite honestly, Daesh, ISIL is just not strong enough against a conventional army. And I'm on public record, Daesh, ISIL is an army, and it takes an army to defeat an army. But the Saudi-led bloc, competes with the Shia-dominated Iran for influence, and now Russia has entered in on the side of on the Shia side, supporting Syria. So back to what you highlighted earlier, Steve, of the dog's breakfast. It is hugely complicated, and as they say in downtown Baghdad, when you try to lay out what we would think to be simple military and diplomatic waypoints, say, Hatham al-Aqad is very complicated. And there is no simple solution, as Tamara highlighted earlier.
Hey, Phil, you started this by mentioning that, or expecting that in 120 days we might have a deal with Russia, if I recall correctly. So what's that deal look like? What are the arrangements? 250,000
or whatever people are dead. So the question, I think, is do you accept some sort of solution that's ugly? That is, the Russians come up with a paper solution about, a convention in a year and elections in 4 years that nobody really sort of believes is going to happen, and figure out some way to use that as leverage for a ceasefire. I think the solution is going to be stop the bloodshed and get a political solution that we pretend answers our values and interests and actually really doesn't, because we want to stanch the blood flow.
So that challenges the sequence of
and
defeating and destroying ISIS and then dealing with Assad.
I think it's dealing with Assad first, and then and the Russians are going to largely dictate those terms. We're going to pretend they don't.
Yeah, and I guess the key question is whether the people doing the fighting on the ground will respect that outcome, or whether we're willing to enforce it in a way that we haven't indicated so far that we're willing to do.
Other questions? Right here, please.
My name is Emily Whalen. I'm a second-year PhD student in the history department. And I had a question about the domestic economic landscape of a lot of these countries. I think that something that doesn't get highlighted a lot is that many things that manifest as ethnic and sectarian disputes have at their core intense economic disparity. And the instability of a lot of authoritarian regimes starts with the sort of entrenching of a very disparate economic status quo. So is there a way for us to draw more attention to the economic disparity that underlines a lot of this instability in the region?
Well, sure. I guess I see the two as very tightly integrated. And I think that the more social scientists dig into these questions, the more they're filling out the nature of those connections. So, you know, why are autocrats generally bad at producing equitable development in society? Because they rely on elite coalitions to remain in power. That means they extract resources from society for the benefit of elite coalitions, not for the benefit of all. And sustaining that requires corrupt practices that over time divert more and more resources. And of course, all of these problems are exacerbated when you're dealing with states that primarily rely on pulling their money out of the ground, not out of taxing people, right? So I think that these have been mutually reinforcing patterns of economic and political behavior in the Arab world for a long time, not only in the Arab world. We've saw similar things in other regions in earlier eras. But I also think that these are not insurmountable. You know, one of the challenges Tunisia faces right now, amongst many, including a civil war next door and a domestic jihadi threat that's quite severe, is tremendous economic disparities. And so now, having been through 2 sets of elections and writing a constitution with nice rights guarantees and multi-party coalitions and all this good stuff, they still have to figure out how to reform a corrupt economic system in order to deliver for people. And if they can't do that, they won't succeed politically. So it takes, I think part of the problem we have as analysts is that it takes a much longer arc for this stuff to play out in the economic sphere than it does in the security or the political sphere. And so we don't always see those connections, but they are there.
I would echo that. I would say that there are bigger issues even than just the questions of inequality or disparities. I mean, a lot of these states in the region have really not progressed economically over the past decades, as I mentioned. So if you looked, for example, at Egypt and South Korea after World War II, Egypt had the higher standard of living, the higher economic indicators. But the problem with Egypt is it's largely stayed there, whereas South Korea has progressed tremendously in many different ways. The same would be true if you compared Egypt and China. A lot of them have the same problems. It's a bloated public sector. It's very high youth unemployment. It's a poorly functioning educational sector. It's a lack of a private sector, difficulty starting businesses. These are things we can actually help with, and where our help might actually be more welcome than it is on some of these other issues. And so I think it needs to be a more central part of policy. And you can't construct a sort of theory of everything as people try to do, but I think that if you help on the economic side, it does overall help the situation in the region. And I'll say that where I agree with what Tamara said, but I disagree with the last part. I think what we fail to recognize is that the security and political sides of things have very long arcs as well. This goes back to what I said. It's just that we feel like we have tools in front of us that we can use to solve those things, and so we think they'll be quick. But in fact, the security issues have not been quick at all. The nuclear negotiations were not quick, and so forth. So if we treated these as all as sort of long-term problems that we need to sort of address gradually, then we might have a better track record than we do.
Yeah, we touched on this in the last panel on stability operations at pretty good length. And as we started off on this panel on the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, others, I mean, they have the fundamental needs just like us. They want security, they want peace, they want to have a job, they want to raise a family. For an Iraqi male, it's all about honor and being able to take care of the family unit, period. And so being able to get those humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, I mean, all those things. Just 4 months ago when they, quote, retook Tikrit, we get into the Shia militia groups or whatever else, so that's a whole nother panel. But getting the supplies, the foodstuffs, the fundamental sewage, water, electricity, those sorts of fundamental things that is a part of a society and the basic governance that needs to happen after a military action, the infamous Phase 4 that we routinely talk and read about. But I'd also highlight internationally, we touched on a second ago about those countries that are in the fight. I mean, all the countries in the Middle East are not fighting ISIL. And quite honestly, they have their own individual secondary needs that are pressing their own economies. And oh, by the way, we put a hell of a lot of effort into this growing global coalition, but we're also, and have seen for several months already, there is significant growing donor fatigue, regardless of what category, whether that's foodstuffs, HADR, military support, munitions, weaponry, stuffs, etc.
Philip, anything on security, economics?
No, I don't do economics.
Larry, right. Do we get it? Thanks, Al.
We keep hearing about Assad as if it was the problem of a single individual. He is also the head of the Alawite community. And it's a minority community that frankly faces fears extinction if Assad is removed. And I think that, it's like the mirror image of Iraq. They can look at what happened to the minority community next door, and I see very little discussion about what would we do without Assad.
Philip, can I ask Philip to weigh in on this? This is about democracy and losers and permanent losers.
Well, I mean, thank you for making my point. I think there's a potential for a bloodbath against the Alawites if there were a democratic process in Syria. I do think that this concept of safe areas merits further discussion. I know that evidently the military doesn't like to hear it, but I remember serving and watching the safe areas in Iraq, which is a fundamentally different story, but it can be done. I think we have a humanitarian crisis on our hands that we have some responsibility for, and that I think has security implications for Europe. But I think transitioning to a process where we allow that society to repeat the errors of Iraq would be tragic.
I'll just add very briefly that I think that it's absolutely a legitimate issue, and it's clear that any solution, any political solution, not only has to include Assad stepping down, but it needs to include protections for minorities. And frankly, I think we've recognized this now for a number of years. I wrote about this in 2012, when frankly it would have been easier because you didn't have the other side dominated in the way they are now by the jihadist groups, which have this kind of ultra-violent ideology. I'll say, though, that I think at the same time there's plenty of evidence that suggests the Alawites themselves are treated very poorly by Assad. They're being drafted and conscripted to go fight. And it's not as though it's all sort of fun and games for the Alawites, or that he's good for them. So I think that there could be a solution there, but it's clear that protecting minorities will have to be one of the things that the international community takes on in any bigger solution to Syria.
Okay, anything in the center? Right here, ma'am. Yes, I have. We have a microphone coming. There you go.
Thanks. My children say I have a dog training voice, and so I just use it. Yeah. But for Mr. Mudd, I have this question. We heard a lot about Putin last night, and it was apparent he's a chess player, and he tends to move pieces around. Yeah. It seems to be an assumption that Putin would not give up Assad. However, one thing that has been pointed out by some commentators in the Financial Times, there's a possibility that Putin moved into this area as sort of a counterpoint to the Ukrainian Crimea situation, and that there might be some, chess moves here. What's your thought about that?
I love answering questions about Russia as a counterterrorism guide. And somebody else, I'm sure, will have better thoughts. I have a simple thought. I would not conflate Putin's interest in retaining influence in Syria with Putin's interest in retaining Assad. I could see an agreement where Putin's pressuring, along with the Iranians, Assad to leave, but that still retains the Alawite security apparatus and Russian influence. I think he wants influence. I don't see why that necessarily is the same as wanting Assad.
Yeah, I agree. It is all about the influence, and as also with some of the news and op-eds that you've kind of highlighted, the Russian increase of influence in the region directly tied to the decrease of U.S. influence in the region as well.
By the way, I do take offense that you describe yourself as a dog trainer and then address your question to me, but we'll move beyond that.
For the record.
Yeah, more kibbles and bits.
John McLaughlin in the front row.
You know, you've all been in government for long periods of time, so I want to try this idea on you. And, you know, in what I write, I try to offer solutions so as not to play into the image of an intelligence analyst as someone who admires the problem. You know?
Pays well, yeah.
So I just wonder if this is what's going on. I address this to people who've spent a lot of time in government. I like to follow the sociology of public debate and government decisions. So if you go back a couple years, and this isn't a political comment, the administration was saying things that implied they thought this problem had eased, terrorism and just generally eased. When that became apparent it was not so, as the general pointed out, we began bombing when our consulate was threatened. Then some Americans are beheaded and we send 1,200 troops. As the situation declines and as public pressure and debate continues, we authorize 50 special operators. Now you look at the public debate and it is centering on all of the things that everyone has talked about up till now. Read General Petraeus' testimony in September. Listen to what Pete Mansour said in his panel about recommending even a NATO solution. Look at my congressional testimony and Ryan Crocker's 2 days ago, and our list is not innovative. It's the one new thing on it that we haven't done, and then you hear Hillary Clinton yesterday, is safe zone. So I think pressure will now build. I will predict that sometime within the next, let's say, 2 to 3 months, there will be a consensus that we need to figure out a way to do a safe zone. The one thing left that I talk about in my testimony and others talk about, Pete Mansour referred to, is ground forces. These two panels, very useful because it emphasizes to me, you talk about stability operations, it goes to the argument of can you solve this problem with air power? Because with air power, you may kill ISIS in these cities, but then what happens? You don't have stability at all. In fact, it may be that ISIS moves into some, but anyway, you see where I'm going. Sooner or later, someone on the ground, them or us or some combination, has to do something that resembles stability operations at some point that we think approximates victory. And I just wonder, as government veterans, are we moving slowly along this path to building a consensus that we're going to have to do that in some way?
I mean, look, I agree with.
Yeah, how much time do we have on this one?
Really.
I'm gonna keep
question.
it brief. I'm gonna keep it brief because I agree with your analysis, John, of how we have arrived here. I think we've been very reactive, and there is this sort of disease in policymaking that when you give decision makers, strategy A and strategy B, they want A plus B over 2. When that's not a strategy, it's just sort of a bit of a muddle, right? And I think that's where we have been. I think that, personally, I would say that it could be. I mean, you've heard now people arguing for ground forces. One of my colleagues, Jim Jeffrey, who used to be ambassador to Iraq, used to be deputy national security advisor, wrote in the Washington Post we should send in a ground force. I think that, frankly, if you were to put together a strategy, I don't think it necessarily needs to include a big Western ground force. And what I've heard from both the U.S. and French leaders and so forth is that we don't want a big ground force. But saying we don't want, this goes back to my point, saying we don't want boots on the ground is not in itself an answer to, okay, how are we going to accomplish the objectives we've outlined? And that's I think, what's missing. And I think if you don't have it, you are susceptible to this sort of slippery slope problem.
Yeah, I'd highlight, and you and I talked briefly on this earlier. The bottom line is this. I mean, ISIL can and is being degraded by air power. Whether that is high-value targets, individuals taking out the key nodes, command and control capabilities, logistics, resupply, et cetera, et cetera. But somebody has to provide the infantry on the ground to hold terrain, whether that is Raqqa, whether that is Mosul, et cetera, at some point. So the question is, who is going to do that? As we highlighted earlier, whether that is a combination of a coalition of the willing or those not so willing in order to step up and do that. It gets to the point that we briefly touched on in the last panel is, what is the United States resolve to do this? And you listen, everybody, we lost 4,489 souls. Used to be 88, but with the loss of our Master Sergeant from Delta last month, and now 89. So, do we have, the political will and the national will of the American people to increase that total? And I agree somewhere in the middle between Jim Jeffries. He and I have not talked about this, but certainly Stu Jones and I and others have, along with our current CENTCOM leadership. Is there some trade space there in the middle of increasing the current amount of soldiers on the ground to accomplish a particular tactical or operational objectives in addition to a potential no-fly zone? And the best military advice that we have provided, through the chairman, and Joe Dunford has walked this through, and we've all read this in the news, of can we do this? The answer is yes, no question. We've got the capability and the resources. But there's trade-offs. It is a huge suck of resources to establish a no-fly zone in northern Syria. And so, yes, we can do that, but then what do you stop doing elsewhere across the combatant commands? And we do a hell of a job already of partnering and trading and providing capabilities of ISR platforms, all of our capabilities for remotely piloted vehicles, our drones, et cetera. But establishing that no-fly area in the northern Syria enclave is a course of action. We just have to make the decision.
So I'll chime in quickly and give Phil the last word. 2 points. First is, if we look at the history of civil wars and how they end, the ones that manage to end through negotiated agreement, those negotiated agreements only survive with some external enforcement, some third-party enforcement. So I think that drives strongly in the direction that you were suggesting. Now, whether in the Syrian case that needs to be a large, across Syria, Western intervention force, I think is a separate question. And it may be that the safe areas, the establishment of safe areas and locally based governance can provide some kind of alternative or some mediating factor. So it's not all about outsiders coming in and kind of keeping a lid on things. But the other thing that your question, John, really drives me to think about is that at the end of the day, we have to keep our eye on the politics of this region. I mean, keeping in mind Clausewitz's dictum about war and politics, right? These people, whether it's ISIS or the Iraqi government or Bashar al-Assad, they are fighting to determine the order of this region. Who rules over what, how. And to the extent we can, what we need to be trying to do is shift that argument off the battlefield and back into the political space. Stability operations in some form is a necessary transition, but it is not the answer to that question. The answer to that question is a political process, probably multiple political processes at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level. And so what I would urge is, as Mike said, we got to keep our eye on the objectives. I think we have to keep our eye on the politics.
Philip, last word.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the only way we will see security is some end of the Civil War. I mean, I can't imagine a continuing Civil War where we don't have ungoverned spaces where people potentially plot against Europe and the United States. So that's a judgment or a bias I have. I don't think we can get where we want to go without an end to a Civil War. That didn't become real for values-based people who wanted to transition away from Assad until refugee flows started sparking, until people started dying in Europe. And so I think the fundamental transition to get to where you're going is people said, now we have to actually pay attention and potentially move away from the ideals that we've been expressing for years because reality is a pain in the ass. And I think what that will mean is people, and I won't beat this dead horse, people will take solutions that end the Civil War because that brings short-term security, but it will not bring a transition that we want.
That would be the mud doctrine of reality being a pain in the ass.
It's the University of Texas. What do you want?
Very good. A quick announcement before we say thank you. We're headed upstairs, one level above. I think it's Salon C. We'd like people to move up there relatively expeditiously. We're going to hear from Chancellor Bill McCraven, friend to many in the room. Let's thank our panel.